Civilizations that never met each other kept describing the same impossible creature. Some gave it wings, some gave it horns, some said it rose from water, others said fire. Different names, different worlds, different centuries. But beneath the differences, the same shape kept returning. Cultural exchange explains some of it. Stories do travel, but not all of it. Dragon-like beings appear in myth on every inhabited continent. Europe, Asia, Africa, the Americas, Australia. Long before scholars compared these myths, the image was already there. Carved into jade 5,000 years ago in China, painted onto rock in the oldest shelters in the world. Scholars, mythologists, and evolutionary psychologists have spent decades trying to explain why. None of them agree, and that's what makes this disturbing. So what was the real animal behind the dragon myth? Were they born from bones no ancient mind could explain? Enormous skulls surfacing from the earth after 1,000 centuries of rain? Or did ancient people remember them from something closer? From teeth, scales, and ambushes in the dark. For millions of years, our ancestors lived alongside giant snakes, massive crocodilians, and monstrous lizards that could grow over 20 feet long. Predators with the power to drag a human into nothing. The dragon may be less a fantasy than a memory distorted by thousands of years of myth, but rooted in something that was once very, very real. The real dragon history is not a fairy tale. It is a record of what watched us from dark water, what circled us in tall grass, what our species feared long before we had a word for fear. This is the true origin story behind the oldest nightmare on Earth. And it didn't come from imagination. It came from memory. You just heard the question. Now we begin to answer it. Every culture on this planet built systems to explain the darkness around them. They built gods. They built rituals. They built warnings encoded into story and image and song. And in nearly every case, across continents separated by vast oceans, one creature appeared at the center of those warnings more than any other. Not the wolf, not the bear, not any warm-blooded predator that hunted by day. The dragon. Scholars have proposed two broad explanations for why this image persists across cultures that never contacted each other. The first, fossils. Ancient people found enormous bones buried in the earth, skulls 10 feet long, teeth the size of a human forearm, and reached for the nearest explanation their world could provide. They named what they found. They built mythology around it. The second, evolutionary memory. Some researchers argue that the human brain carries a specific, deeply embedded fear response to large reptiles, a sensitivity built over millions of years of being hunted by things with scales and cold eyes. Not a learned fear, an inherited one. Both explanations carry real weight. Neither one is complete, because the dragon myth did not come from a single source. It formed where fossil discovery, inherited predator fear, and direct encounter with living giant reptiles all overlapped. And over centuries, those separate origins hardened into one impossible shape. What follows is not just mythology. It is myth colliding with natural history. The creatures behind at least some of these traditions were not imaginary. They lived. They hunted. In several documented cases, they shared the earth with our direct ancestors for far longer than any of our timelines have acknowledged. A farmer in ancient China once found something in his field that stopped him cold. Not gold, not jade, a tooth, the size of his entire hand. He had no idea what animal it belonged to. Nobody did. The people who found them had no framework for what they were looking at. The science of paleontology, the study of prehistoric creatures and extinct animals, did not yet exist. There is no language for an animal that had died tens of millions of years before the first human ever walked upright. So they reached for what they had. They called them dragon bones. They ground them into powder. They sold them in markets and used them in medicine. They built layers of tradition around the sites where such bones surfaced. Here is what modern science has since confirmed. Those bones were real. Not dragon bones in any mythological sense, but the remains of creatures so vast and so alien in proportion that no living animal offered a useful comparison. In the Gobi Desert alone, researchers have recovered dinosaur vertebrae the size of boulders. Theropod skulls studded with serrated teeth. Long-necked sauropods stretching over 40 feet from end to end. The animals that left these remains were not abstractions. They were physical objects that ancient people could hold, weigh, and attempt to categorize. To a farmer in ancient China, encountering one of these skulls in the earth, the elongated snout, the hollow eye sockets, the rows of teeth, the active interpretation was not irrationality. It was the only available response. The dragon myth origin in East Asia is not purely symbolic. In part, it is a record of fossil discovery processed through the only lens available. China was not the only place where this happened. In ancient Greece, the word for dragon, draken, originally meant something closer to one who sees clearly. It described a creature defined by its gaze. Patient, watchful, impossibly old. In Greek myth, dragons did not merely destroy. They guarded, they observed, they endured. On the island of Samos, off the Turkish coast, ancient Greeks documented enormous bones inside coastal caves. They named them the remains of monsters and giants. They incorporated the sites into existing myth and built shrines nearby. Modern paleontologists have since identified that Samos was once home to Samotherium, a large, giraffe-like creature that went extinct several million years ago. Its skull, encountered without context in a cave, would have presented as something entirely beyond the natural world. The researcher Adrian Mayers spent years documenting these connections, tracing the geography of ancient fossil finds against the geography of ancient monster mythology. Her conclusion was measured but significant. Many of the great beasts of classical myth had a physical basis. Real remains, real locations, real animals that had died so long ago that only stone was left. Not all dragon myths come from fossils. Not all fossil discoveries became dragon myths. But the overlap is documented, recurring, and global. The ancient world was not exclusively inventing monsters. In a significant number of cases, it was finding them. And that matters, because it reveals something about the limits of this explanation. Fossils account for an enormous scaled, ancient thing with enormous jaws and hollow eyes. They explain awe. They explain reverence. They explain why an ancient scholar might look at a 10-foot skull and decide it needed a name. But fossils do not move. Fossils do not hunt. Fossils do not follow a camp through the dark or drag something into water. And many of the dragon accounts across cultures describe exactly that. A living animal, an active predator, something encountered, not excavated, which means the fossil explanation, while real, is only the first layer. Beneath it is something older and considerably more dangerous. Early humans were not safe. This is a fact the modern world has largely set aside. We exist behind walls and glass and electric light. We have made ourselves, for most practical purposes, untouchable. But for the overwhelming majority of human history, and for all of the pre-human time that came before it, our ancestors were prey. And the things that hunted them left marks that no subsequent generation has fully erased. Some evolutionary psychologists argue that the human brain is unusually sensitive to specific predator cues, particularly serpentine movement, low-bodied ambush posture, and unblinking forward attention. Not a general wariness. A precise pattern recognition system that activates faster than conscious thought. This idea is debated. It is not settled consensus, but is supported by enough behavioral research that it cannot be dismissed easily. And here is what makes it relevant to the ancient world. The prehistoric world was full of animals that matched every point of that predator profile. Not approximately, precisely. Begin with the snake. Titanoboa aeruginosus, recovered from a coal mine in Colombia in 2009, stretched approximately 43 feet and weighed over 2,000 pounds. It is the largest snake the fossil record has produced. It lived roughly 60 million years ago, long before the first humans. Titanoboa is useful for one reason: scale. It establishes what the giant snake prehistoric lineage was capable of producing. But Titanoboa is not the animal that matters here. The animals that matter are the ones that were alive when we were. The reticulated python of Southeast Asia regularly reaches 23 feet. Verified individuals have exceeded 26. Ancient populations, before sustained human hunting pressure reduced their numbers, may have been larger. There are indigenous oral accounts and old photographs showing pythons of a size that would represent extreme outliers by today's standards. For early humans moving through the forests of Southeast Asia, which many researchers believe was a critical corridor in our species expansion, these animals were not occasional encounters. They were environmental constants. A 20-foot snake, motionless in a tree above a trail, patient in the way that cold intelligence is patient. That is not mythology. That is natural history. Now, consider the crocodilian. Sarcosuchus imperator lived approximately 112 million years ago and reached up to 40 feet in length. Ancient sea monsters and river predators of more recent prehistory were smaller, but the reduction in scale did not make them less dangerous. Purosaurus, a giant caiman from South America, lived only 8 million years ago. It reached 30 feet. Its calculated bite force exceeded that of any creature ever formally measured. But neither of those is the crocodilian that matters for this investigation. The Nile crocodile, which reaches 20 feet in exceptional individuals, was present throughout the ancient world in population densities far greater than today. Ancient Egyptians built a god around it. Ancient Greeks documented it with recorded awe. Roman naturalists wrote accounts of individuals so large they resisted easy description. And now consider what the Nile crocodile actually is when you look at it without the modern context of wildlife documentaries and zoo enclosures. Armored skin, explosive violence erupting from absolute stillness. A semi-aquatic body that belongs to no single world. Not land, not water, but both. Eyes that glow at night from the far edge of firelight. Enormous jaws. A silhouette so ancient in its proportions that it looks like something from another era of the earth. Because it is. This is not a monster from myth. This is a memory. The giant snake and the enormous crocodilian account for much of the dragon. The serpentine body, the armored skin, the water association, the sudden and total violence. But neither of them fully explains one feature that persists across dragon imagery on almost every continent. The terrestrial, lizard-bodied form, four-limbed, low to the ground, moving through open scrubland rather than through water. There's a third animal, one that most researchers pass over entirely, and it may be the most significant candidate in this entire investigation. If what you just heard is beginning to alter something in how you understand the prehistoric world, that response is appropriate. This channel follows evidence in a places most documentary series do not enter. It treats the ancient world as something that actually happened, not as backdrop for reassuring stories. If that is the kind of history you want, you already know what to do. Australia has always been a place apart. Its wildlife evolved in isolation for tens of millions of years, producing animals that exist nowhere else on Earth. But among all the extraordinary creatures that once inhabited this continent, one stands above the rest in the context of this investigation. Megalania prisca, the giant ripper lizard. Megalania was a monitor lizard, the same family as the Komodo dragon, scaled to a degree that is genuinely difficult to absorb. Conservative scientific estimates place it between 11 and 15 feet in length. More recent analysis of larger fossil specimens suggests some individuals may have reached 18 feet or beyond. At minimum, it weighed several hundred kilograms. Larger estimates approach 1,000 pounds. Now consider what this animal actually did. Monitor lizards are not passive predators. They pursue prey over distance. They use forked tongues to follow scent trails across enormous ranges. They're patient in the specific way that cold intelligence is patient. Not aggressive without calculation, not emotional, simply persistent. For decades, scientists believed Komodo dragons killed primarily through bacterial infection, that their mouths harbored such a concentration of harmful organisms that a bitten animal would eventually succumb not to the wound itself, but to what grew inside it. In 2009, that explanation was overturned. Researchers confirmed that Komodo dragons produce venom, not the kind delivered through hollow fangs. Venom secreted through glands in the lower jaw, introduced into a wound when the animal bites and tears. This venom prevents blood from clotting. A bitten animal may escape the initial attack, but it weakens, it slows, and eventually it stops. And the Komodo dragon, patient, persistent, reading the scent trail, is already waiting. Now extend that behavior to an animal 3 times the length of a Komodo, heavier than a modern lion, operating in open Australian terrain where there was nowhere to hide and no high ground to reach. Human beings arrived in Australia somewhere between 50 and 65,000 years ago. The exact date is still being refined as new prehistoric discovery sites push the timeline backward. Megalania, based on current fossil evidence, survived until somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 years ago. If those dates are even roughly accurate, the overlap is real. And if the overlap is real, encounters were likely, not certain. The fossil record is incomplete, and absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But given the timeline and the geography, contact is difficult to rule out. The first Australians arrived on a continent they had never seen. They had no inherited cultural knowledge of its predators, no oral tradition warning them about what lived in its open plains and dense forests. They moved through Megalania's territory with no prior understanding of what Megalania was. Now consider what that encounter would have felt like. Not as abstract natural history, as experience. Silent movement through scrub, no sound before contact. A tongue tasting the air around the perimeter of a camp while the fire was low. An attack arriving not as a roar, but as sudden, overwhelming weight and tearing. And then, because this is what venomous monitors do, the animal withdrawing. Waiting, following the weakening trail. A predator that did not need to win immediately, only eventually. That experience, if it happened, and the timeline suggests it may have, would not have been forgotten. It could not have been forgotten. It would have been encoded into whatever system of memory that community used to preserve dangerous knowledge. This is where the most sensitive part of this investigation begins. The Aboriginal Australians maintain traditions, collectively described as the Dreamtime, that are among the oldest continuously living knowledge systems on Earth. They are complex cosmological frameworks. They encode relationships between people, land, and time in ways that have no equivalent in Western intellectual tradition. The Dreamtime traditions of Aboriginal Australia are not fairy tales. They're the oldest continuously living knowledge system on this planet. Tens of thousands of years old, unbroken, and embedded within several of these regional traditions, across communities separated by vast distances of Australian interior, is the same creature. Large, reptilian, territorial, something that took adult humans and did not return them. Researchers who documented these accounts in the field noted one consistent detail across separate communities. The creature was not described in the past tense. It was described as something that still required caution. That is not mythology behaving like mythology. That is oral record behaving like field observation. Now step back. Southeast Asia. Giant pythons encountered by expanding human populations. Their movement, their scale, their capacity to kill silently and from concealment. Remembered, encoded, mythologized. Africa and the ancient Mediterranean. Enormous crocodilians rising from rivers that were central to early civilization. Armored, ancient-looking, impossibly violent, worshipped and feared in equal proportion. Australia, a giant terrestrial monitor lizard sharing territory with the first humans to ever walk that continent. Patient, venomous, enormous. 3 different animals, 3 different continents, 3 separate encounters with the same category of predator. long-scaled, cold-eyed, patient in a way that no warm-blooded predator ever quite managed. Over time, across generations of encoding and re-encoding, many cultures gave that accumulated danger the same general shape: the dragon. Something shifted approximately 50,000 years ago. It shifted across multiple continents, in different climates, across thousands of miles of separated geography. And whatever drove, it permanently altered the composition of life on Earth. The megafauna began to vanish. In Australia, the giant wombats disappeared. The marsupial lions went silent. Enormous short-faced kangaroos ceased to exist. And Megalania, the giant ripper lizard, the terrestrial dragon of the ancient continent, went with them. In the Americas, ground sloths the size of small elephants disappeared within a few thousand years of human arrival. Giant armored glyptodonts vanished. In Europe and Asia, woolly mammoths, cave lions, giant hyenas, all gone within the same compressed window. The scientific debate about the cause continues. Climate change was a real factor. The planet was undergoing significant shifts during this period. But the timing follows human expansion with a precision that climate alone does not fully account for. Everywhere humans established themselves, the large animals died. This is not an accusation. Early humans were not operating with any awareness of long-term ecological consequence. They were hunting. They were competing with apex predators for territory and survival. But the result of that competition, applied by a species with human intelligence and human coordination to animals that had never encountered that combination of traits before, was permanent. And here is where this investigation arrives at a question that requires careful handling. The extinction dates we work with are not exact. They are estimates derived from fossil evidence, and the fossil record is incomplete by its nature. Fossilization requires specific conditions. Most animals that have ever lived left no recoverable trace at all. A last confirmed fossil date is not the same as a last confirmed living animal. In 1910, a Dutch colonial officer confirmed the existence of an enormous monitor lizard on the island of Komodo, unknown to Western science until that moment. Local fishermen had known of it for generations. Their oral accounts described it accurately. Formal science simply had not followed their knowledge to its source. In 1938, a coelacanth, a fish whose lineage was believed to have died out 66 million years ago, was found alive in a South African fish market. Caught by a fisherman. No announcement, no discovery, just a fish that was not supposed to exist anymore, sitting in a market. Consider what the coelacanth actually tells us. Not that giant reptiles are hiding in remote valleys. Something more specific, more uncomfortable. Extinction dates are the latest fossil we have found, not the latest animal that lived. Those are two completely different statements, and mainstream science has spent decades conflating them. The Komodo dragon was confirmed by Western science in 1910. Local communities had known about it for generations before that. Their accounts were accurate. Science simply had not followed the knowledge to its source. The coelacanth was found in a market, not a research station, not a nature reserve, a fish market, by a fisherman who thought nothing of it. There are documented accounts, recorded by field anthropologists, not tabloid journalists, of encounters with monitor lizards far beyond any known living species in size, in regions that elders refused to enter, recorded in the 20th century, not resolved, not dismissed, simply sitting in field notebooks in university archives. We do not know when Megalania died. We know when the last fossil dates do. Those are not the same thing. And anyone who tells you otherwise is giving you a cleaner story than the evidence supports. The animals most capable of inspiring the ancient world's dragon mythology did not die out in a world before humans. They vanished in a world we had already entered. Some of them may have coexisted with our ancestors long enough to leave more than bones behind. Here is what this investigation leads to. No single fossil, no single predator, no single encounter can explain the dragon on every continent. That is not how myths form. They accumulate. a skull surfacing from eroded sandstone in one century, a crocodilian rising from a river in another, a giant snake in a forest system that no community allowed its children near, a lizard that tracked its prey across open ground until the prey could no longer move. Over generations of retelling and re-encoding, separate fears resolve into one impossible animal. The dragon is a composite, built from real experiences, real encounters, real death, exaggerated by time, transformed by culture, given wings and fire and treasure to guard, but not invented from emptiness. Fire came later. Venom became flame as the image traveled through generations that had never personally seen the source animal. A creature that killed from the mouth, through venom, through crushing, through tearing, became, over centuries, one that destroyed with breath. A blast of carrion heat became smoke. Smoke became fire. The Chinese farmer who found the enormous skull in the earth was not dreaming. The Greek shepherd who discovered enormous bones in a hillside cave was not inventing. The Aboriginal elder who warned travelers away from a particular valley was not telling a fairy tale. They were preserving what they knew in the form available to them. Not a report exactly, but memory under pressure, hardened into story. We did not simply outlive the animals behind the dragon myth. In most cases, we outlasted them because we outcompete them. We moved into their territory. We hunted their prey. We brought tools and coordination and a kind of persistence that cold-blooded patience, however effective across millions of years, had no evolved response to. And then, because we are human, because we encode danger in a narrative, we took the memory of what we had displaced and transformed it. We gave it wings because what had once been a physical threat became something that now lived in the imagination. And in the imagination, it could fly. We gave it fire because something that had killed through venom and patience deserved, in memory, a power that matched the fear it had generated. We put it in distant mountains and deep water and sealed caves, places safely removed from the present world, because the alternative was to carry forward an accurate account. And the accurate account was this. We were once small. We were once prey. The things we now call dragons were once the things we built our fires to keep away. For most of human history, the dragon was not a story told by the fire. It was the reason we built the fire. What we covered today is one layer. There is another beneath it, older than the dragon myth, found in geological strata that researchers did not expect to find it in, on a continent where its presence raises questions that current models cannot cleanly answer. Some of the researchers who encountered what we will discuss next paused before publishing. A few chose not to publish at all, not because the evidence was weak, but because of what the evidence implied. We have followed it anyway. We will go there next. If this changed how you see the ancient world, leave a comment with what reached you most. Every comment tells us you want to go further into this. And we always go further. The ancient world does not become safe simply because we stopped looking at it.